Hi, everybody. There's a lot of you here today than I've seen in the past. It was a very informational kind of speech, and without a doubt, that Governor Shapiro has a real appetite for spending. This is the third year in a row we're going to spend a lot more, billions more dollars than what we have. We can't spend money that we don't have. We can't spend down our rainy day fund. We can't spend down all of our reserves. Where does that leave Pennsylvanians? You know, when I listened to a lot of what he was saying, I thought, boy, yeah, maybe, but how are we going to pay for this stuff? There was something in that budget for everyone, and there was a way to pay for it. And he based his budget a lot. There's probably close to $1 billion based on things that aren't even passed into law yet, such as recreational marijuana and skill games. We don't have that passed into law. So we're basing numbers in a budget on something that doesn't exist. I think we tried that last year. He tried that, and we still don't have those things passed. They may never pass. They may pass. We can't count on that revenue to pay for programs. We can't do it. We need to, and I'm going to get to education here because, yes, we need to make sure our kids are ready to succeed. He talked a lot about education, and, you know, some of it's good, but we still have failing schools. We didn't hear a word about the kids that are trapped in those failing schools, regardless of how much money we're spending on education. Those schools are still failing, and those kids are still trapped. So we're going to work to deliver educational opportunities for every child, because every child in Pennsylvania deserves a chance to graduate from high school and be able to go to a technical school, a college, be qualified to get a job, some way to maintain their families and to make sure that they succeed. We also have to make sure that there is accountability in our education system. We want to make sure that those test grades are okay. So it's an overall picture. It's just not money. Money doesn't fix everything. It fixes some things, but not everything. Also, roads and bridges. Okay? So the governor is proposing, which is to slow down the removal of the state police from PennDOT, from those funds, it hurts roads and bridges. Because that money that we need for roads and bridges, we're still paying for state police. We need state police. I'm so happy about that we're going to have more recruits and more officers. But we can't hurt roads and bridges. Transportation, I heard him say that it has to be for every aspect of transportation. I agree. But roads and bridges are part of that transportation, and he's already went and robbed $152 million from future funds coming from the federal government to pay for just one mass transit agency. So mass transit is extremely important to many people in Pennsylvania, but I'd bet that most of Pennsylvanians drive to work. They use those roads and bridges to get themselves to work, to get themselves to school. I know I live in a county that has mass transit, but it's not mass transit I can go out and get on the bus every morning and go to work. We have to pay for that stuff. We pay for our turnpike fees. We pay for our gas. We pay for our parking. We need those roads and bridges maintained so that we can get to our destinations without going over detours and going over potholes. We need to make sure we can fix those things. It's really important to the economy of Pennsylvania, and having a good infrastructure is important to bring businesses to Pennsylvania, which is something that we all want to do because that brings us jobs. Because we're all tired of losing to freaking Ohio, right? Yeah. You know, one of the things that I'd like to see, in addition to some of the stuff the governor said, is tell us how we're going to offset some of these costs. Streamline those costs. What are we doing with all these buildings? You know I talked about this when I did my pro tempore speech early last month. They've got buildings in Pennsylvania with 10 people in them a day. Why are we paying for all of those buildings, all of the utilities? Why are we paying for that? We need to right size every building that the state can. We're not putting workers, they're not coming to work, they're working at. They might come to work 2 days a week, they might come to work 3 days a week, but the fact is that we have empty buildings that we need to right size, and we need to save as much money as we can. I'd also like to know about his own budget. He increased his office budget by 69% over the past 3 years, from 6.8 million to 11.6 million. I know a lot of those folks are doing public relations. I think we don't have this year's numbers, but he had 26 people doing some type of communication in his office last year. Governor Wolf had 12. Let's see some of that. Let's look into that, give us our numbers, and let's not hold Pennsylvania's hostage to hopes that may never, ever happen because we don't have the money for everything in that budget. It's fine, you want to go out and make everybody happy and everybody love you, but the fact of the matter is that is not all going to happen because we don't have the money, and it's irresponsible to spend where we don't have, because in the end, it might be 2 years, it might be 3 years. I'm sure Senator Martin will give you a more exact time. Pennsylvania, people here are going to pay higher taxes to cover all of these things that the governor is proposing we do. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I'm happy to bring up my partner, Joe Pittman. You know, he's been my partner for like 25 years, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, good afternoon. It is human nature to be all things to all people. And it is great politics to be all things to all people. But it's not good governance. And what we saw was 90-some minutes of wanting to be all things to all people. But when you have to govern, you have to make hard decisions. And that is what our caucus has been about over the last several decades, quite frankly, is that we always are very straight with the people of Pennsylvania in terms of the fiscal realities that we're dealing with. And I know Senator Martin is the chair of our Appropriations Committee. We'll talk about those a lot more. But the reality is we have a structural deficit. Many of you have been reporting on that quite consistently over the last several months. And we have to recognize that we cannot be all things to all people all the times. We're going to continue to focus on what we can do to grow this Commonwealth. We're going to continue to recognize that, yes, in fact, we do have a divided government, and the people of Pennsylvania sent us this divided government in November. And we're going to work through that. We're going to work through the areas that we can agree on. We're going to move beyond the areas that we cannot agree on, and we're going to do our very best to bring a fiscally responsible product to the people of Pennsylvania, but we're going to be very straightforward with the people of Pennsylvania about what our limitations are. And they are many whenever it comes to our fiscal realities. I am encouraged. There are a few things that I do think the governor talks about that we agree on, such as permitting reform, such as figuring out ways to grow the economy. Those are all things that we're willing to talk about. We've demonstrated that we have been willing to talk about them. I noted that one thing he forgot to talk about in his budget was empowering parents. That, of course, was an area of great agreement that we had in his first budget. Unfortunately, he was not able to deliver his own party to that compromise that we had reached. He did mention it in passing in his second budget, and it seems he forgot about it altogether in his third budget. So we're hopeful that he still holds true to what he promised on the campaign trail, to what he promised the people of Pennsylvania his first year in office, and that is, as the pro tempore said, figuring out ways to empower parents to make decisions for their children's educational futures. Because at the end of the day, we do believe parents have the ultimate responsibility for their children's education. They have to take responsibility for their children's education, and we need to empower them to do so. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Scott Martin.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you. First, just a couple things kind of in response to what we saw today and some of the things that he probably thought was a perceived call out of this General Assembly. You know, here you have a body where a lot of our constituents are from and have worked to do things to support Pennsylvania's #1 industry in agriculture all along. For him to take a shot at people when we know that he's looking to pick more winners and losers with certain ways that he's going to somehow save agriculture, or the sheer fact, if any of you noticed, he wanted to talk about avian influenza, which I've been heavily involved in. And yes, we have money sat on the side, but won't you open up his budget book and see how he zeroed out that emergency response money for this year as we go into a really severe situation. And if he only had the same zeal as he does for the minimum wage for the bills that we've sent over supporting families that he claimed he support with Lifeline scholarships and things of that nature. But the thing that bothers me the most, which you really didn't hear too much in this speech and which has such a tremendous impact to the future of this Commonwealth in terms of jobs, investment, grid reliability, and energy prices. You're talking about a guy with one stroke of a pen could repeal his upheal to maintain his power to implement an $800 million carbon tax on Pennsylvanians and encourage investment to bring more certainty to our environment and to push down energy bills. Instead, you want to keep hearing him talk about more bureaucracy and things that government can do. That's part of the problem. That's why we're sputtering and we can't get through, and it's so frustrating, and he quickly pivoted away from energy today. But there is nothing in this budget that he is booking in terms of what he proposed last week, for the record. You know, when I saw media coverage of what the governor's budget proposal might be, someone in that administration must have used the word frugality as a theme. You know, folks, that was the last F word I could think of when it came to thinking about it. I look at this as being fantasy. Because as you all sat through our budget hearings, and last year when they weren't booking the constitutionally required out years of their budget, and we were making issue of that, as you have sat and heard us talk, and you have reported on the structural imbalance that this Commonwealth faces, the dwindling fund balance and rainy day fund discussions that we have had in here, all one-time funds, by the way, out of that. To think that we would be faced with a 7.5% increase in spending, an over $3.6 billion increase in spending. But it gets so much more better than that. I have never seen in all my years of receiving a budget or listening to how they were going to spend it or how they're going to pay for it, have seen more inflated numbers in terms of revenue in my life. Over a 5-year planning period, and I'll let you gauge why he keeps using 5 years to justify what he's budgeting. His revenue projections are $5.1 billion more than the IFO. And for anyone who's followed state government for a while, you may see the IFO is off by maybe a couple $100 million in the administration or from the Senate Appropriations Committee, $5.1 billion in our baseline revenues. But then you take it up a whole nother level. You all were here last year when you heard him talk about, let's have a tax on adult use recreational marijuana. He's doubled the projection on a tax that doesn't exist from last year. Let's take it another step further. Games of skill, another tough issue that we're grappling with. Again, another tax that doesn't exist. He has multiplied the revenue projections by 5 in this budget, by 5. So when you combine inflated revenues with a severe underreporting of spending, a simple example, historically, entitlement program, Medicaid can change depending on what federal administrations want you to do, has grown by about $1 billion a year in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He's booking $330 million. We are going to drive off the fiscal cliff. And for what purpose is he inflating numbers and underreporting spending? That's what we're up against right now. And I will say, if we were to approve this budget that he has put forth, which, by the way, also cuts out about $500 million of historic legislative priorities that are also in there, related to agriculture and other things, workforce development programs like Tech Centro and third-class cities throughout the Commonwealth, all the things he zeroed out in this proposal. But if we were to enact that, a year from now, we'll be negotiating a 2026-2027 budget where we have an over $3.5 billion hole with no money left in our rainy day fund, no money left in the general fund balance. That's what's at stake when we're negotiating. And yes, we're in divided government, and yes, they're going to have some priorities that are different than ours. But if they're serious on some of their priorities that are important to them that we might be able to find common ground on, for the love of God, work on closing our structural deficit, and we'll work with you on different things. But we are at a real important moment in Pennsylvania's fiscal history, and I, for one, and this caucus behind me, are ones that are not going to back away from the work we did to try to stabilize this Commonwealth over the last few years. So thank you.
Couple questions?
Where specifically would you like to see less spending in proposal?
I'm sorry.
Can you name a couple places where you would like to see less spending than Governor Shapiro is proposing?
Well, I think one of the big areas that we have in the spending front is the human services. I talked last week about utilization, for example, of the Ozempic drug within Medicaid. That is driving costs through the roof in our human services fund, and we've got to get our arms around that. We cannot continue to sustain the growth in the human services budget. That is one area. Obviously, the education piece is another important piece to have a conversation about, because the reality is we are educating fewer students in this Commonwealth every year, and we continue to increase funding for public education. We have to start recognizing that we should be looking at our per pupil allocations in terms of what it is we're driving out to students on a spending basis. So those are two very, very broad areas that I think Scott Martin could attest to that really drive budgetary expenses. And then of course there are several other of his smaller initiatives out there that I think are very duplicative in terms of the things that we already have in place in the governmental structure. But those are two pieces that I think you'll be hearing a lot about from us in the months ahead.
And if I can just finish. There is plenty of opportunity if you're willing to do it. I think you guys have all reported on the fact that we have some severe demographic challenges. We got the smallest kindergarten class since '86 working its way through, the number of kids graduating out of Pennsylvania high schools. So you should naturally want to look at where's that occurring. And if you have enrollment declines of over 20% in a school district or 10% here and another, how do you adjust for that? There's one thing in here that I say is a positive we'll be able to work with them on, is that they actually bring up the closure of potential 2 state correctional institutions. Right off the bat, that should save us about $100 million a year each. So combined over 5 years, that could save the Commonwealth $1 billion. I'll note, though, that his spend is so intense over the next 5 years that he's only booking it as like $100 million savings over the course of that entire time. We have Senator Argyle, who recently had a hearing on just the incredible amount of vacant and underused properties across this Commonwealth, that not only are our assets that aren't being utilized, but untold amounts of money being used to maintain them and keep them. But the biggest, as Joe mentioned, a huge driver of our budget is Medicaid. And there are things that can be done. Who knows where the Trump administration goes in terms of what kind of flexibility it gets states to devise plans. I know this, having a state that continually is seeking, that's the #1 driver of the increase in spending this year, is in human services. And if you recall, they sought an 1115 waiver because they want to provide rental costs for inmates coming out of prisons for 6 months, or at-home grocery delivery services for pregnant women, which I wish, a lot of our colleagues never, had the benefit of. All these kind of things add up on costs, and there are ways we can do this. But what he's producing here and projecting here and what he's putting in front of us will only hasten the problem.
Leader Brennan, in terms of no-cost solutions, the governor focused a lot on healthcare policy. He brought up the idea of nurse practitioners having independent practices. He brought up the idea of checking private equity's acquisition of healthcare systems. Is that something, are those policies that Republicans get behind?
Well, I think those are all areas where many members of our caucus have focused on throughout our districts. Obviously, we all represent very diverse communities, rural, urban, and suburban alike, and we have been very focused generally on the issue relative to making sure we have access to health care. So I think that those are, at least in broad concept, issues that have interest among the members of our caucus. But I think I want to underscore something. We heard 90 minutes of words today. You've got to put words on paper to enact laws. Okay? It's one thing to talk, it's another thing to act, and details matter. And so all of the platitudes that we heard today are just that, platitudes. This was his day. Now it's time for our process to go forward, our appropriations hearings, and the due diligence that we will have to make sure we understand the details of everything that he's talked about.
Are you saying that I haven't provided enough details in the past on pushing policy?
Yes, I would say that, yes. They're more hat than they are cattle.
Do you think that there's any greater chance of agreement this time on marijuana or skill games or any of the revenue sweeteners that the governor has in there?
So those are really two big items that the governor talked about last year and again this year. Booked, as we know, 3 times as much money for one, 5 times as much for the other. But the governor needs to lead on something. If he wants something done, he needs to lead on it. He can't throw an idea out there, which he did last year, and say, let the legislature figure it out, I'll sign it. Then I'll go do press conferences all over the state. He has to lead on something. What is his priority? What will he do to get some of this stuff across the finish line?
The specific skill games tax, I think, was 52%. I know the Senate leadership also introduced a bill. Does that sort of gel with your version of what you see skills games taxing looks like?
Well, again, when we talk about broad concepts, I do think that this caucus has shown a interest in regulating games of skill. We amongst our caucus have diverse opinions on how best to do that. I think we all recognize that, but it's probably one area where we can certainly focus on to address. But I think to the pro temporary's point, when these kinds of conversations come up, we really need a governor that's engaged and engaged in the fine print in the details, because again, the details of all of this matter. We're willing to build consensus on the issue. We have put out a proposal, Senator Ward, Senator Gebhardt, Senator Brown, and I. But again, that proposal is not written in the 10 Commandments. We're willing to have conversations about what it would take to move forward to put parameters around these games of skill.
And I do think we need to get the House on board, because it doesn't sound to me like they want to do anything. It is really important, not just for the tax dollars, but it's really important that we regulate those games of skill. There are many players right now in Pennsylvania. Some are good. Some would never pass a background check. And as long as we're sitting here doing nothing, it's proliferating into all of our neighborhoods with no regulation and no taxes. I think this is a very, very important issue. And I hope the governor picks up the reins, doesn't just talk about it, actually goes out and works with us to get something done.
Are there any additional streams of revenue you guys are looking at to tackle this structural deficit that you've been talking about?
You know, I think anytime you're looking at, when you're looking at closing a structural deficit, you're going to look at all potential opportunities out there. And if we have the opportunity to potentially do tax reform in some fashion, it actually can make Pennsylvania's rate more competitive, but not pick as many winners and losers as part of it. I think we're open to looking at that and analyzing that and having discussions about that. But I think, you know, in the situation that we're in, and all that is left is what people are pointing to, what's sitting in the rainy day fund and the dwindling amount that's left in the fund balance, which is all one-time money. It behooves us all to look at where we can make improvements on spending and what are we looking at on things like games of skill or potential other tax reform. So we'll try to analyze all that. And I'm sure it'll be a conversation that comes up throughout our hearings as well.
For your first blush reaction to the corporate net income tax changes that the governor proposed today? Rate reduction, broad base?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this, is that we already have been on that path even before he even got here into office on this reduction of the CNIT that we had negotiated with Governor Wolf. The little piece that we really need to talk about is the combined reporting aspect, which basically puts that on a whole different level in terms of what that means to our a lot of folks in our business community. And so I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot of those that would be impacted by that. But historically speaking, it's always been something that overall in our economy and being competitive would put us in a place of being less competitive and do more damage to us wanting to grow the state. So again, we're going to fully analyze that and what he wants to do, and it'll probably be part of our hearings as well.
We'll take one more question.
What do you think that the state should be more conservative in its state budget this year in anticipation of federal cuts?
Well, I don't think there's anything to do with federal cuts. Look, I'm quite optimistic that once the Trump economy takes root, we'll be just fine. But we can't rest our laurels on that. I think what we need to do, the more we act now to make more conservative budgeting on both revenue and expenditure, the better off we'll be in the years ahead. As I said, everybody except the governor today has acknowledged the structural deficit that we have and the realities that we are heading toward fiscal instability. And the sooner we act on both expenditure side and making sure that whatever we're doing on the revenue side is the most logical approach to generating revenue, the better off we'll be. But it's hard to estimate and predict. As I said, I think that the best thing we have going for us is the Trump economy, but only time will tell.
So what's the right number to leave in the rainy day fund?
Well, most of the rating agencies will tell you anywhere between 10 and 15%. I think a bigger question that everyone should ask is when you talk about taking money out of the rainy day fund, it's only supposed to be done for emergency purposes. I mean, it's clear cut in law. I mean, and where do you fall on what's really an emergency? But for me, right now, the immediate threat is that being wiped out completely. And as you're all aware, and us getting positive outlooks, us getting bond upgrades, us being able to save on refinancing of debt to the tune of just one issue saved us over $100 million. All that goes away. Once you start going down that path and the rating agencies see that, then they start moving you into a negative outlook. Then they downgrade you. Now we're paying more money in interest. So it's a big negative across the board if we go down that path.
Okay, thank you all very much.